In today's video, we're going to be making 3 unexpectedly cozy soups, and not only are they absolutely delicious, they are also extremely easy to make. We're going to be making pickle soup, Napa cabbage mille-feuille, and a soup inspired by one that my aunt would make. And just to put a name to that soup, we're going to be calling it Ima's meatball soup. So let's start off with my current obsession, which is Ima's meatball soup, which is essentially a pork-based broth with carrots and corn. So it's a little bit savory, a little bit sweet, and absolutely so cozy. For this recipe, you're gonna need some ground pork. You can either buy a pork shoulder and grind it yourself at home like my aunt does, or you can just buy pre-ground ground pork like I do. You're also gonna need some carrots, some green daikon. You can also use white daikon, but just keep in mind if you use a white daikon, it's gonna have more of that white daikon, like slightly bitter flavor to your soup. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about substituting some of these root vegetables. You're also gonna need a few pieces of frozen corn to add a little bit more sweetness into the soup. And that's essentially the base of the soup. From there, we're gonna add some enoki mushroom, or you can add some shiitake mushroom if you'd prefer, some watercress, and some silky tofu. To season 1 pound of ground pork, we're going to add some salt, quite a bit of white pepper, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of soy sauce, and a little bit of oyster sauce. I'm adding just a touch of cornstarch to make the meat a little bit silkier, but not too much. And give it a good mix. To make sure your pork is properly seasoned, you can cook a small piece of it to taste and adjust accordingly from there. Now that is all mixed, I'm just going to cover it back up and work on our vegetables. For the vegetables, we're going to start off with a green daikon, and since I'm essentially making enough for just 1 serving, I'm just going to cut enough for just my 1 little pot. I'm cutting them to be around this size. The smaller they are, the softer they'll get as the soup cooks. If you cut the chunks too big, they just won't be as tender when the soup is done. We're also going to use a regular carrot. Again, I'm going to peel it first and then chop them up roughly to around the same size as the green daikon. And I'm going to add just a few enoki mushroom. Now that our vegetables are all clean, let's assemble our little pot. I'm going to throw just a few pieces of carrots in here first, along with the daikon. Since my pot is quite small, I can't add too much in here. I'm also going to add some watercress to my soup, and I'm also going to add some silky tofu. And just for some added sweetness, I'm just adding a few pieces of frozen corn. Now we're gonna grab our meat, and you can definitely roll it into like little balls, but I'm just gonna scoop 2 spoonfuls of pork into my little clay pot. You can add as much or as little as you want. It literally does not matter. And before we start cooking it, we're just gonna add a small cup of water. Now you're gonna put the lid on the pot, grab a bigger pot, put this guy inside, and we're essentially going to cook this in a water bath. So we're going to add water to this bigger pot, put a lid on it, and throw it on the stove at about medium heat. And once it starts to boil, you're going to let that boil for another 35 minutes, and then your soup is ready. Oh no! Don't forget to add a little bit of salt before you eat it, because that'll just really bring out all of the flavors. It is so good. It is so good. It is so like warm and cozy, savory, and just like a little bit sweet. This has been my current obsession, and I've been eating it every day for like the past week and a half, and I will continue eating this for probably another week and a half. You know, a lot of people say like ADHD hyperfixation on food is like not a good thing, but I think it's great because you cling on to something that you like, especially if it's nutritious, and then you don't have to think about when you want to eat because you know what you want to eat. It is that same dish, and you will eat it until you no longer want to eat it anymore. And that is what this dish is for me right now. Now, I did mention earlier that you can cook the soup in the double boiler method, and that is like still my preferred way to make this soup. But if you don't have any way to do the double boiler method, then you could definitely like boil the soup and it'll still be good. It's just not going to be as good. So this soup right here, I kind of did a mix of both methods. So I made a big batch using like the slow boil method, and then I froze it, and then I reheated it using the double boiler method. And it is better than if I was just boiling it over and over again to reheat it, but it's still not as good as just double boiling it from the start using the raw meat and the vegetables. Like when you do that, the flavors are just like more pure and a little more intense, and it just tastes so much better. Like it's completely worth it. The clay pot that I was using to do the double boiler method that I like broke the lid to a few seconds ago, that actually came in like a free frozen meal from the Asian store. And I mean, the meal was like not great, but the meal plus the clay pot was only $7. So I figured a clay pot is probably gonna cost me more than $7 to buy. So I bought like 2 of those frozen meal sets, and that's how I got this clay pot. But today, since my frozen cubes didn't fit into my little clay pot, I used this like mini crock pot innard that we've been hoarding for years because the crock pot broke like years ago, and this was just too good to throw away. So this is actually the perfect use for this like crock pot innard. I threw it inside of a stock pot, and then I used one of these guys, these like grated little guys, and put it on the bottom of the stock pot, and then put this crock pot innard inside of my stock pot, and then filled it with water so the crock pot innard isn't like directly touching such high heat. And that's like a really easy way to make more of the soup at one time versus like one serving size in the little clay pot. But it just depends on like how many people you're cooking for, how much you want to cook, and how much you want to freeze. So there are many options and many substitutes that you can like switch out and do whatever with. But the one thing I would not recommend you like switch up is the cooking method, because it really does make like that much of a difference. So good. So good. Depending on how big of a pot you have, you can make a huge batch and freeze it afterwards so you don't have raw meat hanging around. But since I only have small pots to use for the double boiler method, this is what I do. I keep my meat and veggies separate by saran wrapping the meat before adding it to my little container, and then I add the rest of the ingredients. After it's all packaged away, I pop them in the freezer, and this is ready for me whenever I want. I don't freeze the tofu or the watercress, but I usually stock my fridge full of tofu, and I'll add it to the soup the day of. The next soup we're gonna make is the pickle soup. This is actually a Polish recipe, and the first time I had it was at a Polish restaurant, and this absolutely is the definition of unexpectedly cozy. Even if you aren't a huge pickle fan, like I'm not a huge pickle fan in general, I absolutely love this soup. But I will say, if you don't like pickles, don't make this soup, because it does taste like pickles, but you don't have to be a pickle fan to be a fan of the pickle soup. For this recipe, I'm gonna be using 4 potatoes, and we're gonna start off by peeling the potatoes and chopping them up into little tiny squares. And that way they can get cooking in the chicken stock while we prep the rest of the vegetables. The smaller you cut the potatoes, the faster they'll cook down. So I'm cutting these into really small little cubes, roughly about like 1 inch by 1 inch. Now you're gonna take your stock pot and dump all the potatoes in there. And you're gonna add some chicken stock. I've added nearly 2 cartons, but as long as the potatoes are covered, you should be good. I'm just putting a lid on it and I'm gonna pop it on the stove and let that boil while we work on the rest of the soup. Now while that's boiling, I'm going to wash and cut 1 leek and shred 1 carrot. Now it's pretty important that you wash this leek properly, and washing it just as is not good enough. I cut usually where these little leaves branch off from the stem and once more right below that, and I give this a quick little slice. And the reason is all this dirt gets trapped all up in these little crevices, and that's where it's like the dirtiest. So you can't properly wash a leek without cutting it apart and then washing this dirt out. And you can see on the inside of these leaves, there's also dirt trapped all up in there. So it's really important to wash that out. Now for this stem, I do like to cut it vertically first before slicing them into really thin slices. And the recipe does call for onions, but I like to replace onions with leeks whenever I can, just because leeks are a little more gentle on my gut, so it's all personal preference. I also love the look of just like a little bit more green in my soup, so that's why we're switching out the onions for the leek. And I like to slice this about, you know, this thin. It really doesn't matter, but the thinner the better. Now for the carrot, I'm just gonna use 1 carrot. Usually I would do about 2 if I'm using 4 potatoes, but this guy I got from the Asian market yesterday and it is massive, so I'm only gonna use 1 carrot. I'm just gonna peel it and then I'm gonna shred it. To shred it, I'm just using this little cheese grater, and I'm gonna use like the second to smallest setting. And you want your carrots to be shredded just about like this. So we're almost ready to take this to the stove, but before we do that, I'm gonna take a whole jar of pickles. I know the recipe usually calls for like 4 spears or whatever. I'm gonna use the whole jar because I like my pickle soup pickly. I'm just using the Mount Olive kosher dill spears that's already cut into 4ths, which makes my life much easier. And I'm just gonna slice these into tiny little pieces and throw it into my little bowl of vegetables right here, and we're gonna stir fry it all together. You know, you could be a little bit more civil and use some chopsticks or like a fork to take these pickles out, but since we're using the whole jar, I'm just gonna reach on in here and grab them. Now, don't dump the pickle juice because we are gonna need that for the soup. We're gonna use this entire jar of pickles, juice included, so don't dump it out. This is not food for you. This is pickle soup. You don't eat pickle soup. Do you? You do? You wanna taste some pickle? See, you don't eat it. Now we're gonna take all of this, warm up a little frying pan, and stir fry this all together. Now, with the remaining pickle juice, is there a pickle in here? Let's try that again. With this remaining pickle juice, we're gonna take our sour cream. I'm gonna use some dairy-free sour cream from Violife. And just to save myself from having to do more dishes, I'm just gonna pour the sour cream directly into this jar of pickle juice and mix it together. Pleasant noise. Abby, this is definitely not for you. Now, it's just gonna take a little bit of stirring, and it's gonna seem like this is never gonna mix together, but it does. Now that this is pretty thoroughly mixed together, I'm gonna add some flour. I'm using Bob's Red Mill gluten-free flour, but you can use any flour you want. This is just to thicken the soup at the end, so the more you add, the thicker the soup is gonna be. Since I don't want it to be like chowder-like, I'm gonna be a little bit lighter on the flour. And you're just gonna use about 1 spoonful of flour. And you want this to be super well combined before adding it to the soup. Once your veggies are all cooked down, you're gonna add them to your stock pot and let that simmer. Shortly after, add the pickle juice concoction to the stock pot and simmer for another 5 to 10 minutes. After the potatoes are all soft, add salt to taste and the soup is all ready to be served. So for all of the extra soup, I packaged them away in these little silicone molds that I got off of Amazon. I know they have like a official brand name one that you can get off of like the official website. I'll link it down below, but I'll also link these ones that I got off of Amazon down below as well in case you guys are interested. They come in like these little 1-cup sizes that I think are perfect for like a single person, like a 1 meal type freezing situation. But they also come with these 2-cup sizes, and this has actually been perfect for me because when I cook for me and my boyfriend. So the 2-cup size is actually super handy as well. And they freeze into these little cubes, and I just warm them up whenever I want to eat them on the stove or in the microwave, and it's just like a really convenient way to meal prep without feeling like you're meal prepping. And they're pretty easy to store because they could just like stack on top of one another and it doesn't take up that much space at all. I am currently storing them in a Ziploc bag, which is not ideal. So if you guys have any storage solutions that are like plastic free or like reusable, let me know in the comments down below because I am looking for an alternative to store these like bricks of food. So we've got our little bowl of pickle soup and it's all ready now. And this is actually re-warmed up from the frozen cube and it literally is like as good as when it's fresh. It's just so like potatoey and pickly and so cozy. And the only difference between this versus when it's fresh is that the potatoes got cooked down a little bit more as I was reheating it again. So if you want more of that like brothier pickle soup, I definitely recommend adding a little bit of chicken broth as you reheat your frozen cubes and it'll be as good as fresh. But if you want it to be a little more chowdery or a little more like mashed potatoey, then rewarming it as like the cube and letting the potatoes cook down a little bit more will give you that desired result. You can also add some fresh dill on top when you're serving this, but I keep forgetting to add the fresh dill. Even when I buy the fresh dill, I just forget to add it to the soup, so I always omit it and it's still just as good. It's just like cozy and like slightly pickly, but not too pickly. It's like a very cozy, like unexpected flavor profile that really works together. The only thing I'll say about this dish is that every time after I eat it, it doesn't keep me full for that long just because it's so like carb heavy and there's not really much like substance in here. So I like eating this with a side of protein just to keep me full a little bit longer. You can also throw like real chicken into this soup and that'll add some more protein to it. But I did that before, but I think it kind of throws off the soup a little. Like it's not as good as the soup without the chicken in there. So I prefer to have the protein on the side and then the soup as like an additional dish to whatever meal I'm eating. Last but not least is essentially the Napa cabbage mille-feuille. I've been seeing this recipe all over social media lately and I absolutely love it. It is not only extremely cozy and delicious, but it is nutritious and it's easy to make. The Napa cabbage mille-feuille is actually super easy. All you do is separate the pieces of a Napa cabbage from its little stem and you just do that all the way around until the leaves get a little bit too small. This is actually so many days later because as I was editing, I realized that I accidentally deleted like all of this footage. So it was very sad. I may or may not have cried a little bit, but it's okay because, you know, I still need to eat today and I'm always down to eat another Napa cabbage mille-feuille. For the beef, I add some salt and paprika to it and then I let it marinate overnight or like sit overnight as it defrosts. And then I add some like warm water, not like roaring boiling water, to the beef and I kind of let it sit in that like warm water brine. I'm not sure exactly what it does, but my boyfriend, who is much more familiar in the kitchen and, you know, food, told me to do this, so that's what I'm doing. I've seen a lot of people make this recipe and they essentially just stack the raw meat in between the Napa cabbage leaves and then they cook it on like a medium heat and then their meat is super tender and the Napa cabbage is like a perfect consistency or like texture, but I think that only works if you have really fresh beef. So if you live near a Korean market or somewhere that has really fresh beef, then I think that method would be safe for you to do. But since I live somewhere where the beef is not like the freshest, I've noticed that when I do that, the beef is just like a little tough. And if I were to cook it longer until the beef is like tender and juicy, then the Napa cabbage leaves get a little too mushy. So I've tried different methods while making this dish. I've tried slow cooking the beef first to soften that up and then sandwich it in between the Napa cabbage. But then I think because the beef is so thinly sliced, when it's like slow cooked that way, it just takes that like beef consistency away and then it becomes like a little mushy again. That's also why we're doing like the warm water brine, to kind of let it sit and like cook a little bit before we sandwich them in between these Napa cabbage leaves. And that way, hopefully it'll be done cooking at around the same time. So now that the leaves are getting kind of tiny, I'm just gonna stop right there and cut off the stem and stick this in the middle of the pot. If it's too tall, then I'll cut it in half and then stick it in there. But don't waste your time like peeling the rest of this Napa cabbage. Like, you don't need to do that. You can use whatever pot to cook this Napa cabbage millefeuille in. Like, you can use those stock pots that we just used for the potato soup. But I'm gonna use my little Dutch oven. This one's from Staub and it has a cute little Christmas tree on it. I love it. I love using this so much all year round. But as long as you have a lid that fits the pot, you can make this dish. Now, starting with your bigger outer leaves, I try to find the biggest one I can because that way it's just easier to stack. You're gonna take your leaf, you're gonna take a slice of beef, and you're gonna line it until the entire Napa cabbage is covered, essentially. And I'm like not super exact with it. Like, I essentially just cover up the white part. I don't try to like cover up the entire leaf. But once that's essentially covered, I add another leaf and then I add more beef. And then I add one more layer of leaf, and that's all I do. I do like 3 leaves and 2 layers of beef. And then I cut them into thirds. And then I stack my leaves and I tuck them around my cabbage heart center. And then I just repeat that until all of my beef is gone. And when you're packing the leaves and the beef into the pot, really pack it in there. Like, as if you're packing on vacation and you don't want to pay for a checked bag. Once that's all packed in there, I'm just gonna add a little bit of liquid. I'm just gonna add water, but you can add chicken broth, you can add a dashi, you can add whatever broth you want. I'm keeping this a pretty like basic flavor, like no added flavor, so that each time I rewarm it, I can change the flavor up depending on what I want to eat that day. And I'm adding about 2 cups of water. I like my finished dish to be a little more on like the soupy side. Like, I like having a soup to sip on as I'm eating Napa cabbage and beef. But if you want it to be more of like a non-soupy dish, just add a little bit less water. And just for some added flavor, I'm gonna add some shiitake mushrooms into my pot, and I'm just gonna lay them on top and kind of shove them into the crevices where I can. Now I'm just gonna pop the lid back on and pop it on the stove. I'm gonna cook this on essentially low heat for about an hour. Even though it takes a little bit longer than the recipes online, I find that the beef and the cabbage cooks a little bit more evenly at this heat and this temperature, so that the beef is a little more tender without the cabbage becoming completely mushy by the time I eat it. Also, keep in mind, if you're going to package away some of this for later and you're gonna reheat it each time you make it, the cabbage is gonna be a little softer, so you can cook it for a little bit less time, keeping in mind that you're gonna cook it down more when you reheat this. When you're picking out your beef, you want to make sure that the package of the beef isn't like puffy, like there isn't like air inside of it, like it's like a balloon puffing out. You want to make sure the packaging is like flat. My brother told me that if the air looks like it's like puffing out, like if it's bubbled out, that means there's bacteria inside the beef or like the packaging, and it's better to just avoid those. So if you didn't know that, now you know. Avoid the puffy looking beef packages. this turned out so delicious. What started off as a Napa cabbage milfoy has now turned into essentially a cabbage soup with some beef in it. Especially the way I flavored it today. It is absolutely delicious. It is so warm, so cozy, and you really wouldn't expect this level of like comfort in your soul and your tummy from a cabbage, but here we are eating cabbage soup and feeling absolutely so cozy and so happy. Today I did a Thai inspired flavor, but you can do a Korean inspired flavor, a Japanese inspired flavor, a Chinese inspired flavor. So let me show you some of the different ways I would season this dish. For today's Thai inspired flavor, for one serving, I used about a small spoonful of the My Ploy chili paste in oil sauce. And by the way, none of these measurements are exact. It really depends on how much you're making and how strong you want these flavors to be. So I always say err on the side of caution. Start with a little bit less, taste it as you go, and add more of whatever flavor you feel is missing. Especially if you're a little newer to cooking and you're a little intimidated by all the different flavors, just know that these flavors typically just go together and you could just start with less and always add more as you go. So we're gonna do one small spoonful of the My Ploy chili paste, and I'm gonna add about 2 splashes of this coconut milk or coconut cream, about 2 splashes of this 3 crab fish sauce, 2 sprinkles of this Thai chili pepper flake. You can use any red pepper flake that you have if you don't have the Thai one. I think the Thai one's just like a little bit of a darker flavor and a little bit more spicy. And just a sprinkle of salt at the end. If you think this is too like savory and a little too sour, you can definitely add a little bit of sugar. You can use palm sugar or white sugar. And again, just add a little bit at first and see how you like the flavors. And if you want this to be more of like a regional flavor, you can add a little bit of lime juice in there, and that'll just bring a little bit of tartness to the soup, which is also delicious. For a more Korean inspired flavor, I would use about 1 spoonful of gochujang. Again, just add a little bit at first and then add more as you go along. A little bit of sesame oil, and a little bit of soy sauce to taste. And for all of these, I add the flavoring as the soup is essentially boiling, or as long as there's liquid in the pot, that's when I add all these flavors in. It really, I don't think it matters that much. Maybe depending on when you add the flavoring, it'll be a little bit more robust or less robust, but when I'm reheating food and making it in the morning, I kind of like don't really care, and I just add all the flavors together, and in the end, it pretty much tastes the same. It's soup, you're flavoring soup. For a Japanese inspired flavor, I would use a little bit of dashi mixed with water, or if you already have the broth in there, just pour a little bit of that dashi into the broth. A little bit of miso if I feel like the flavor is a little bit lacking, and again, if I feel like I need a little bit more salt, then I'd add a little bit of salt at the end, but that's essentially it. If you want more of that like Chinese flavored cabbage soup, you can throw 1 slice of ginger in and maybe like 1 crushed garlic and let that cook and add some salt at the end. Very, very easy. And that'll bring more of that like Chinese flavor profile into your cabbage soup. Well, that is all I have for you guys today. I love all of these recipes so much and how easy they are to freeze and reheat whenever I want to eat them. This has been such a game changer for me because I essentially get to have a home-cooked meal every day without having to cook a home-cooked meal every day. Let me know if you guys have had any of these soups before, or if you're going to make any of these soups, and let me know how it goes, because I have been living off of these soups this whole winter. Anyway, thank you so much for spending time with me, and I will see you next time. Bye!